Chapter 4. The Wolf's Den. Vilmos found it awkward to run in the dark. Pausing, he took a torch from the wall and lit it, and the flames illuminated the hordes of rats that lived in the tunnels. He rushed on, and the rats made way for him. All too soon, he heard the shouts of soldiers following, much closer than he'd like. He knew exactly where he was going. He planned to follow this tunnel for at least 3 leagues, till he reached the secret exit that opened into the cover of the forest. "If the soldiers know that exit, I'm done for," Vilmos said to the rats. "I hope I'm fast enough." Inside the bag, the sylvan, whose name was Amicus, awoke. The bird saw Irina's sleeping face above him, barely lit by Vilmos's torch. He heard the would-be magician swearing and cursing to himself as the bag bumped against his back. Very carefully, the bird eased himself past Irina, taking care not to scratch her skin with his claws or beak. When he reached the lip of the bag, he squeezed out and began to stretch his wings. Vilmos felt feathers at the back of his neck. "Get back in there, you horrid buzzard," he shrieked, reaching round to stuff the bird back into the bag. Pecking wildly, Amicus writhed out of Vilmos's grasp and flew into the shadows, beating his powerful wings and looking back at Vilmos as if to taunt him. Captain Kellen grimly led his men down through the trapdoor and into the foul tunnel. By now the Queen was awake and screaming. The captain was glad he'd left 4 men to guard her. Mothers think they can do anything, and this particular mother could wield a sword better than many men. He didn't want Queen Chloe going after the villain herself. The soldiers held her down while she bit their hands and thrashed about, terrified for her baby. "Irina," she cried. "Let me go, you brutes! Let me find Irina!" Pitying her, the soldiers loosened their hold. The Queen shook their hands off and reached for the nearest soldier's sword, but he stopped her by grabbing her wrist. "Help me, for Jan's sake," cursed Meinhard, a young soldier with the face of a boy. The others surrounded her. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," said a more senior soldier, "but I think it's best if we tie your hands." "Don't you dare!" shouted Chloe, watching Meinhard hand him a rope. "I'm a Junsong warrior. My child is gone and you want me to rely on that stupid donkey Kellen." "Kellen knows what he's doing," said Meinhard, thinking he was soothing the Queen. He was wrong. "You'll all lose your jobs," she screamed. "Let me go, you wicked brutes." Outside Pavel Castle, King Harman mounted his horse and prepared to return to Ragnar. Little Prince Andor had followed him out. He was fascinated by the warrior king and his magnificent stallion Quabil, who was a rich golden colour with a light mane and tail. His own father had beautiful dark steeds, black, brown and midnight blue, while the house of Ragnar rode horses of gold and chestnut. The allied kings always knew each other in battle. "What are you doing here, young Andor?" Harman said to him. "Where's your nurse? Don't tell me you've escaped her again." Grinning, the boy nodded. "Well, you'd better go find her, or she'll be in trouble with your father." "Don't like nurse. I only want my mama," said Andor, whose mother had died not long ago. "I can understand that, son," said Harman, "but she's a good nurse, and she loves you. Now where are those pesky servants of mine?" Impatient to return to Ragnar, Harman looked over his shoulder into the stables, where his servants were loading the horses. Andor was staring up at a bird in the sky, a carrier pigeon. The pigeon swerved downwards, swift and light and unerring in its aim. The king's hand tightened on the reins. "One of Razel's," he said. The pigeon lit on Harman's wrist The king unrolled the small piece of paper attached to the pigeon's foot, read it, and gave such a loud bellow of rage that little Andor jumped in fright. Harmon tossed the note away and kicked Kabyl's sides with his huge boots. The great golden horse broke into a gallop. "Quick!" yelled one of the servants. They dropped their parcels and swung themselves astride their horses to follow their master before he disappeared into the forest. Kabyl was much faster and stronger than their own horses. The boy picked up the piece of paper and held it in his fingers, his eyes wide. He was too young to read, but he knew the note featured just a single word. He stared at the letters, trying to decipher their meaning. Vilmos. Sweat poured off Vilmos as he raced through the darkness, knowing the way out couldn't be far now. The soldiers would be following, and he felt sick with nerves, wondering what would happen if he were caught. He remembered Jabade's warning. "I'll just have to keep running," he said. "What about you, Iniko, and the wizards of Nartesk? Will you help me now?" Vilmos swung the bag around to stop Irina bouncing so hard against his back, but soon found it exhausting to hold the baby in one hand and the torch in the other. "Surely Harmon won't break his own laws to have me killed," he thought. "But he'd lock me in the dungeons for a start. Would he whip me?" The thought of dungeons and whippings spurred Vilmos on. He pressed Irina to his chest, gulping for breath. He was ecstatic when he saw fine threads of sunlight in the darkness ahead, where the outlet of the tunnel was covered thickly with ivy. No sign of any soldiers. He crouched down and shuffled through the small opening on the hillside, sweeping aside the rats on his left and right, and hastily scrambling to his feet. Running through the forest, he glimpsed the sylvan flying in the shadows. "That bird's watching the baby," he thought, struggling to keep a straight course over the hilly and stony ground, occasionally crashing a shoulder or elbow into a tree. He could faintly hear the soldiers' shouts in the distance. Out of breath, Vilmos scanned the forest for a hiding place. On his left, the trees rose up along a steep incline studded with rocks, where there was a dark opening, a cave. He clambered up through the rocks and went inside the cave. He put the bag that held Irina on the floor, shook his stiff shoulders and stood still, his eyes adjusting to the dark. The air of the cave was warm and thick and smelled of meat and fur. "Something alive is in here," he thought, straining his ears. He heard rustling, the sound of breathing, the pad-pad of feet. What was it? Some kind of four-footed beast? Very slowly, he twisted his neck and shoulders to one side and then the other, looking about him. What creature dwelt here in the cave? He wiped his damp palms on his trousers. Quietly, his heart clubbing his chest, he turned around and came face to face with a magnificent she-wolf, light streaming in from the cave's mouth, causing her eyes to glitter. At that very moment, he heard the soldiers' dogs barking. Dogs? He couldn't hide from dogs. They'd follow his scent here, and he would be trapped. He must run. He lunged downwards to grab Irina, but the she-wolf bared her teeth and growled, taking a step towards him. "No, I will take her," said Vilmos, and lunged again. This time, the wolf jumped up and crashed against him, her forepaws landing heavily on his shoulders. He fell and knocked his head hard against the cave floor. The wolf hovered over him, her lips curled back in a fearsome snarl. Vilmos shouted with terror. Baby Irina began to cry. The she-wolf nuzzled her gently before picking up the bag with her teeth and carrying it behind a boulder where she had her cubs. Vilmos took the chance to get to his feet and run out of the cave as fast as a demon. He leapt onto the rocks and climbed up as though he had wings in his feet. Fear beat like a pulse through him. The dogs were close, and he heard the soldiers shouting, "Head for the cave!" Vilmos reached the top of the rocky outcrop and hurtled down the other side, almost falling at the bottom, but picking himself up just in time to run hard through some open grasslands. No bushes, nowhere to hide. He ran and ran. He heard the roar of the river before he saw it. This was no small creek, but the great river Thel that ran through the island of Ragnar and fed its lakes. It was wide and fast. The river, he thought, if I can just make it to the river. There was a copse of willow trees near the water's edge, and he hurried towards it. Nearby, he spotted an old wine barrel half filled with firewood. He tipped it over, pulled out the wood, and rolled it to the bank. He sat inside the barrel and used his hands to push hard so that it swiveled into the river. The fast current picked up the barrel, and Vilmos clutched at the sides as the water carried him downstream towards the great waterfall and the Mojag bog. King Harman rode Quabil hard through the forest till the horse was slick with sweat. In the distance, he heard men shouting and dogs barking. Razel, too, was riding through the trees towards the river. In the dim light of the forest, she was hard to make out. A swiftly moving, shadowy figure, her hair hidden by her hood, the bulky Hessian sack tied to her front. Harman saw the lone figure, holding a bundle. "Vilmos!" he cried, his heart cold with rage. He drew an arrow from his quiver and raised the bow to his shoulder. "Careful of that bundle," he told himself. "Aim for the shoulder." He fired the arrow, shouting "Fiend" as he did so. Hearing the king's voice, Razel turned her head, and her hood slipped, revealing her face. Too late, Harman realized his mistake. The arrow pierced her and she fell. "No, no!" Horrified, Harman rose up to the wise woman. He dismounted and crouched beside her. "Don't waste time," whispered Razel, her hand clamped to her bleeding shoulder, the arrow protruding awkwardly through her fingers. "Find Irina. The hare says go north and search the caves. Go." When King Harman rode into Bragnor Castle a day later, he was falling out of his saddle with exhaustion, hunger and thirst. Kellen found him near the stables and saw that his master had returned empty-handed. "Your Majesty," said Kellen, bowing low. "How dare you come into my presence?" shouted Harman. "You failed in your duty." The king struggled to his feet. A groom led Quabil into one of the stalls where the stallion could take a much-needed drink. "The caves! Did you search the caves?" the king demanded. "There was one cave, Your Majesty," said Kellen, "inhabited by wolves." "Was it on a stony rise just south of Thel?" "Yes, Your Majesty." A desperate harshness entered the king's voice. "I looked in that cave too, but there was no sign of a baby, living or dead."